Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to welcome you all to this first session of Day 3 of the African Climate Summit here in Addis Ababa. The theme of this session, Accelerating Climate Finance and Debt Relief, Unlocking Africa's Green and Resilient Future, is of course, a paramount important theme. This year's summit builds on the momentum of the first Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi in 2023, where leaders adopted the Nairobi Declaration. Central to the declaration was the demand to overhaul the global financial system and ease Africa's crushing debt burden. These were not merely economic asks. They were lifelines for climate resilience and climate action. The Nairobi Declaration confidently stated Africa is a continent of opportunity, rich in resources, endowed with endless renewables, and home of a young entrepreneurial workforce. This is absolutely true. Given the right financing opportunities, the continent can become a vital part of the solution to the global climate change. But this requires investment, and all over the world, investment is mostly debt financed, be it private and public, and the two are connected. The country risk premium of private investment is clearly influenced by the public debt situation. The worse your public debt situation, the higher also the risk premium for private investments. So in a situation of debt distress, it doesn't help if someone points to the billions of private money that you just need to attract. And frankly speaking, here we are stuck. Many African nations today find themselves in a vicious circle of climate vulnerability and debt. Many of the continent's economies rank amongst the most climate vulnerable in the world, yet also among the least fiscally able to respond to this threat. There is strong empirical evidence that climate vulnerability drives up the cost of sovereign debt, causing a climate risk premium on African debt. The higher cost of capital leaves governments with even less fiscal room to invest in adaptation and resilience. The underinvestment that follows only highlights and heightens and exposes to future climate shocks, feeding back into rising vulnerability to further shocks, setting in motion a vicious circle. Unless we confront the debt crisis head-on, efforts to finance Africa's climate ambitions will continue to fall short. Finance is about numbers. So let me mention 3 numbers from recent report of the Debt Relief for Green and Inclusive Recovery Project using the data from the World Bank and the Climate Policy Initiative. First, Sub-Saharan Africa will require more than US $1.4 trillion this decade and about US $143 billion annually to meet adaptation and resilience goals. On an annual basis, this is more than 7% of their current GDP. This does not yet include mitigation. Second, actual climate finance flows from 2021 to 2023 average just US $35 billion per year, less than a quarter of what is needed. Worse still, More than half of this comes in the form of new debt rather than grants. Third, these same governments are projected to spend US dollars 865 billion, or roughly 4% of GDP, on debt servicing over the same decade. So while we appreciate all contributions to climate finance, which help our countries, unless we alleviate the excessive debt burden on our countries, incoming money for climate finance will amount to a little. Or to frame it positively, debt relief could cover a very significant part of Africa's climate finance gap. Africa's debt crisis is multifactorial, but to a significant extent, it is reflecting a broken financial system that puts poorer countries at a disadvantage. To give you just one example, the United Nations Development Program found that 16 African countries paid an additional US dollars 74.5 billion in excess interest between 2000 and 2020 because credit rating agencies had increased their risk assessments. Africa was also particularly affected by a series of macro shocks in the past 5 years. First, the COVID-19, we all know, that crisis which burdened our countries with additional expense to stabilize health systems and our economies, while important sources of income like tourism, remittances, or commodity export collapsed. Then, as a result of the war in Ukraine, food and fertilizer prices exploded, and food and oil importing countries were hard hit by skyrocketing energy costs. This price shock triggered a wave of inflation as part of the triple whammy, the subsequent steep interest rate rises by leading central banks made reinforcing on the international capital markets prohibitively expensive. And while rates have come down, but only a little, we are still burdened with a mountain of expensive debt. Nobody has better described the critical debt situation of many countries in the developing world than Indermit Gill, the World Bank Senior Vice President and Chief Development Economist. He originally wanted to join us today in this forum, but regrettably had to cancel his participation at a very short notice. He wrote the foreword of the landmark international debt report that the bank published last December. It is a remarkable document, and I really commend the World Bank for this clear aid analysis. What follows is an extensive quote from its foreword authored by him. I quote, "Since 2022, foreign private creditors have extracted nearly US dollars 141 billion more in debt service payments from public sector borrowers in developing economies than they disbursed in new financing. That withdrawal has upended the financing landscape for development. For 2 years in a row now, the external creditors of developing economies have been pulling out more than they have been putting in, with one striking exception. The World Bank and other multilateral institutions pumped in nearly USD 85 billion more in 2022 and 2023 than they collected in debt service payments. That has thrust some multilateral institutions into a role they were never designed to play, as lenders of last resort, deploying scarce long-term development finance to compensate for the exit of other creditors. That reflects a broken financing system. Capital, both public and private, is essential for development. Long-term progress will depend to an important degree on restarting the capital flows that most developing countries enjoyed in the first decade of this century. But the risk-reward balance cannot be allowed to remain as lopsided as it is today, with multilateral institutions and government creditors bearing nearly all the risk and private creditors reaping nearly all the rewards. In the absence of a predictable global system for restructuring debt, most countries facing distress opted to tough it out rather than default and risk being cut off indefinitely from global capital markets. In some cases, new financing arriving from the World Bank promptly went out to pay off private creditors. The result for many developing countries has been a devastating diversion of resources away from areas critical for long-term growth and development, such as health and education. End of the quote. It is time to face the reality. The poorest countries facing debt distress need debt relief if they are to have a shot at lasting prosperity. A 21st century global system is needed to ensure fair play in lending to all developing economies. So much from this remarkable document that spelled out with such clarity the situation that we are in. I'm one of the 8 leaders, former presidents, prime ministers, and vice presidents who have come together earlier this year in Cape Town to form the African Leaders Debt Relief Initiative. We can speak out, advocate, where sitting ministers and heads of government may want to stay silent in order to tough it out in absence of a predictable system of debt relief. President Cyril Ramaphosa was so kind to receive us for an extensive conversation. He strongly endorsed our initiative, not only in private, but also publicly when speaking to the G20 meeting of finance ministers that started the next day. He reminded us that perseverance will be needed. He said that it was never going to be easy to achieve that the African Union be represented as a permanent member of the G20, but African unity and perseverance succeeded in pushing it through, and the same will be true for debt relief. There are still 2.5 months until the G20 meeting in Johannesburg, the first on African soil. Progress on debt is still possible, and we now know it is a priority for President Ramaphosa. To quote another great African leader, Nelson Mandela, he said, "It always seems impossible until it is done." Thank you for your kind attention, and God bless you in this deliberation. Thank you.